KFC, I don't do well in KFC lines because people stare at that menu. It's KFC. They have chicken. You know what else they got? They got chicken. You want chicken or chicken? Get out of the line. Movie theater concession line. People staring at that menu. They got popcorn, candy, soda. That's what they got. What are you looking for? Buffalo wings, prime rib? They don't got that. Get out of the line. Am I the only person in this line that has a movie to catch? That's what I would like to know. The supermarket, I don't do well either. Oh, good, she has coupons. You bitch. It's okay to have coupons, but I always get the lady, I have a coupon somewhere. Somewhere, I know it is. Get out of.
Good morning. It's Thursday, Delta Force Thursday, January the 25th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we'll have news shorts, patriotic shorts, motivational shorts, and instead of having Bishop Barron and Ayn Rand, I'm going to have two reading selections. One is going to be, of course, Inside Delta Force, but the other one is going to be the selection from yesterday, which is None Braver, because yesterday's selection, due to technical difficulties, did not get recorded. So that, plus the 33 strategies of war, all that and more when I get back. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. Now the news shorts.
Kansas City, Missouri, an unusual death investigation is currently underway after Kansas City Chiefs fans were found dead in a backyard following that big game Sunday night.
CB Cotton takes a look at why the case is drawing national attention and raising a lot of questions.
This is a cover-up. Something's wrong with the picture.
Anger and frustration from the families of Ricky Johnson, David Harrington, and Clayton McGeeney. Earlier this month, all three men were hanging out at their friend Jordan Willis's home for football Sunday. 2 days later, all three were found dead in Willis's backyard, with Willis claiming he never noticed something was wrong.
Man up. And tell us what happened. He knows. He has to know.
Willis's attorney says his client saw his friends leave through the front door and then went to bed.
He slept most of the morning on Monday. He got up, and at some point he relocated to the bedroom. He got up on Tuesday morning. He works from home. He had no reason to go in the backyard.
The victims' families and a fifth friend who'd also been inside the house that night aren't buying it.
I'm furious. Everybody's furious. Nobody believes this story.
I personally think they got drugged and were drug out the back door and put in the backyard. I want to know exactly what happened.
While police have not made any arrest and don't suspect foul play, families also accuse Willis and his attorney of changing their story. Willis's attorney, however, says his client did nothing wrong.
These are his buddies. Had he seen those guys out there, he would have gotten them help immediately.
Willis has since moved out of the house. Victim autopsy reports and toxicology results are still pending. In New York, CB Cotton, Fox 32 Chicago.
It's been a back and forth battle between the state of Texas' aggressive initiatives to increase border security and the federal government trying to stop them. Monday, the Supreme Court ruled the federal government remains supreme.
The courts weren't willing to reverse 200 years of immigration policy on this issue.
In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court is temporarily allowing Border Patrol agents to cut and remove about 30 miles of razor wire installed by Texas law enforcement along the Rio Grande.
This is a federal power, and although the federal government is not getting a lot of gold stars on this issue, it is still their responsibility.
And this order sets a new standard as to what Texas can do regarding securing the border.
A question in every other case after this is going to be, is our situation like the fence? Is it more like the fence or less like the fence? And the more you can analogize it to a fence, the more likely it is that the reasoning behind this order is what will control that situation. And that's going to be the challenge for the lawyers on both sides, is making things appear to be or not be like this particular fence.
Governor Greg Abbott and Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton say they'll continue to fight in court to keep that razor wire up.
Ken Paxton says this is not over. And so he has to decide what is his next step and what is he able to do under these new constraints.
Meanwhile, senators are working on a deal to secure the southern border. They say they're close, but aren't quite finished yet.
We're working hard on a bipartisan basis to try to come up with a piece of legislation that will actually help, again, to solve this crisis at the border.
The idea of a Fed put, and the Fed is going to always be there to bail out my bad investment decisions, is really not a cogent investment policy to hold on to for a long time, because it may happen and it may not. And I think that at the end of the day, we all obsess about the Fed and what the Fed's doing, but the fact that it will bail out the stock market at some predetermined level of losses, I think is a very dangerous idea to uphold.
Hi everyone, Dan Murphy here from CNBC Studios in Dubai. I'm watching the price of oil now hit $77 a barrel. WTI at a 2014 high, levels that we haven't seen in about 7 years. The oil market seemingly at a crisis point right now. OPEC Plus, that's the major producer group that includes Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the UAE and others, was meant to meet again last night to try and resolve this dispute that we've seen play out between Saudi Arabia and the UAE on production levels for the month of August. They walked away without a deal, and to make matters worse, they haven't even set a date on when they can meet again. This is extremely concerning for the oil market, which is already up around 50% year to date.
And while we remain committed that we are definitely in a bull market, we are not unaware that the tape has gotten so frothy that on one story about United Health having some cost issues with voluntary elective surgery, the stock of Humana, a great company, has fallen 13%. That's a notable sign. That's a wake-up call. It's a sign that the conviction on this move up is not nearly as deep as you think it is. Consequently, our bias has been to sell. And believe me, I would like to sell more than we have, but the selling's taken our cash position down about 8.85%, or $247,000, which is pretty darn hefty. It's high, given that we aren't negative on the long term. You see, when it hurts to do something, historically, that means it's the right thing to do.
As an us versus them, I'm sorry, I'm not buying into that. I think that's dangerous. And again, look, there's a lot of people, there are a lot of short sellers out there that have been borrowing stock they didn't have. In other words, yes, I think there are dynamics where retail investors can get caught, but it's really a dynamic where I think this is going after bad companies.
And I'll say again, don't think for a minute that hedge funds haven't hired people and put them in these chat rooms to get the flames of these things going. We don't have that. We don't have that tool.
And that was the news shorts. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, military shorts.
Some of the most badass quotes in Spartan history. When King Agesilaus was questioned about how Sparta lacked fortifications, he would merely point at his men and say, "These are Sparta's walls." When the aging king was asked, "How far do Sparta's boundaries reach?" he simply held out his spear and answered, "As far as this can reach." When King Philip was expanding his empire across Greece, he sent a letter to the current Spartan king, asking if he wanted him to enter his lands as a friend or a foe. The only response Philip ever received was a single-word reply, "Neither." When King Philip of Macedon sent a message to Sparta, he said, "If once I enter into your territories, I will destroy ye all, never to rise again." The Spartans' reply was simply the word, "if." When a Persian messenger came to Sparta and demanded a payment of earth and water from King Leonidas, a customary symbol of surrender, he responded with, "Dig it out for yourselves before throwing the messenger down a well."
It was less than 48 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the United States was still scrambling across the Pacific. An armada of Japanese ships were amassing off the coast of Luzon for an invasion of the Philippines, and it was up to the depleted 19th Bombardment Group to slow them down. Armed with only 3 bombs, no fighter escorts, and a half-tank of fuel, Captain Colin Kelly hurried his B-17 Flying Fortress into the air and scored a hit on the Japanese cruiser Notori. A dozen Zeros descended on the lone bomber and set it aflame. Kelly ordered his crew to bail out while he remained at the controls to steady the tumbling bomber so the others could jump before it exploded. Kelly's heroics allowed all but one crew member to survive the first American bombing run of World War II. For his sacrifice, Captain Kelly was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. When they recovered his body, Colin Kelly was clutching a picture of his wife and newborn son.
Our task is to build on, but also build out the combat space power of this nation. There are 3 things we're going to have to focus on in order to do that. The first is generating, presenting, and sustaining space combat power. I'm going to add an I, and that's called improve. Number 2, we need to provide a United States Space Force service force provider to coordinate, prioritize, recommend combat sourcing solutions to solve the Joint Forces problems. Finally, we need to elevate and institutionalize our role as the United States Space Force combat force proponent across our force design and our force development horizon, and we will step into the breach where we have not stepped into before, because you are the experts in the mission, no one else is. It can be done, but no one ever exceeded expectations by listening to their doubts or naysayers. We need to set our horizons high, and we will achieve the goals that we set up. With this kind of team, we can do nothing but win.
They married the day after he enlisted in the Union Army. Frank Barlow was a prominent New York attorney, and his new bride, Arabella Griffith, a member of high society. It was April 1861, and Arabella took up the Union cause by enlisting as a nurse. At Antietam, Barlow was wounded badly. Arabella had arrived that morning and actually nursed him in a makeshift battlefield hospital. Frank recovered just in time for Gettysburg. Again, he was wounded badly and left for dead. It was there that Confederate General John Gordon came upon the dying Barlow and ordered him moved under a tree to go peacefully. Barlow told Gordon his wife was a nurse on the battlefield and asked to get her word that he was wounded. Gordon did, and Arabella miraculously kept Frank Barlow alive. In 1879, Barlow and Gordon would meet randomly at a dinner party, both expressing surprise that the other was alive. Thus began a friendship that would endure until Barlow's death in 1896.
On October 23, 1944, 2 U.S. Navy submarines, USS Darter and USS Dace, were positioned together on the surface, close to the island of Palawan in the Philippines. The sub-captains were casually talking to one another by megaphone, when at 0116 Darter's radar detected a Japanese formation in the Palawan Passage at a range of 30,000 yards. It was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's powerful center force, which was on a mission to destroy the American landing force in Leyte Gulf. Both U.S. subs traveled on the surface at full speed to gain a position ahead of Kurita's formation. At 0524, Darter fired 6 torpedoes, 4 of which hit Kurita's flagship. 10 minutes later, she landed 2 hits on the cruiser Takao. Dace then landed 4 torpedo hits on the cruiser Maya. Otago and Maya sank quickly. Takao was forced to retire, and Kurita was forced to swim for his life.
Why is the U.S. testing this railgun worth $500 million? How it works will blow your mind. Let me explain. The railgun can fire anything at incredible speeds, giving the Navy the ability to hit targets at much greater distances than current weapons can. What sets it apart is unlike normal firearms, railguns don't need explosive missiles, making them safer and more reliable in combat. These railguns don't need expensive ammunition, offering a much lower cost per shot. At the moment, missile shells are hollow and filled with explosives and a detonator. The risks in keeping these on a ship are too high. If anything goes wrong, they will be a bigger problem to the ship and crew than any enemy. But how does it actually work? Railguns need only a simple aerodynamic metal lump. The speed that the gun generates gives it enough force to smash through ships. These railguns still have the option to launch explosives. They'll just be even more deadly. The Navy can't say no to railguns as they improve safety, reliability, and costs.
In fact, that's a really bad day when the B-2 is used, right? Like the B-1, the B-52 are used a lot, as they should be. And they're used for show of force missions. They're used for weapons drops when necessary. But we fly those things for a bomber task force almost weekly now, into the South China Sea, into the Straits, into the Black Sea, up into the Arctic Circle. Like, you want them to be loud and showy, right? You don't want to do that with your B-2s. You want to keep your B-2s, because once you've given up the sort of radar cross-section capability and they get a couple hits on you, that just deteriorates the capability. And that's why the B-2 needs to retire, right? Like,
he flew over 50 combat missions as a B-17 pilot with the 394th Bomber Squadron of the 13th Air Force. He earned both a Flying Cross and the Air Medal for missions over Guadalcanal in the Philippines, among others. And somewhere along the line, he befriended a Chinese pilot who helped him learn the finer points of outmaneuvering Japanese Zeros. His name was Gene Roddenberry, and after the war, he tried his hand at commercial aviation and police work before finally pursuing his passion for science fiction writing. Roddenberry lost contact with his buddy, named Kim Noonien Singh, but used his TV show Star Trek to try and find him, naming their most notorious villain Khan Noonien Singh after him. Decades went by without a word from Kim, so Roddenberry tried again with the next generation, naming Commander Data's father, Dr. Noonien Soong. Sadly, Gene Roddenberry passed away in 1991, never hearing from his beloved friend, but leaving behind an entire universe of his creation.
What happens if someone falls off an aircraft carrier? Let me explain. Falling from a carrier deck is often compared to falling on concrete. Sailors are usually launched overboard due to the insane force from the exhausts of jets on the carrier. If the sailor is seen falling off, whoever saw must urgently alert the navigation bridge by declaring, "Man overboard," on either the starboard or port side, and say which side of the ship the incident happened, so crews can act quickly. At the same time, a life ring is thrown to mark the location, but after receiving the man overboard warning, the officer in charge sounds the alarm on the entire ship. Some sailors must immediately go to a designated place and lower the boats for a rescue mission. Those who are not involved in the search must go to their muster stations for a head count and report back to the bridge to identify the missing crew member. Without waiting any longer, the ship starts a deep search and rescue operation, aiming to locate and retrieve the person who went overboard. Since the fall is so high, nobody can predict their condition.
Is North Korea preparing for war? Right, last week, Kim said that he'd no longer seek peaceful reunification and that he would change the constitution to remove that as a goal. He's also having the country's constitution rewritten to label South Korea as their principal enemy. They will end all cooperation with South Korea, and they destroyed the reunification arch they built to symbolize the goal of a united Korea. And earlier in the year, Kim told the military to prepare for an inevitable war, with experts believing that North Korea gave up on diplomacy after the failed summit with the U.S. in 2019. But the U.S. continues to say that it's willing to negotiate with North Korea anywhere at any time and without preconditions. Meanwhile, South Korea's president said on Tuesday that if North Korea provokes them, they'll be punished much harder. And no one really knows what the plan is here, especially since they're going through a famine and energy crisis. So the U.S. and South Korea have offered them humanitarian and food aid, as well as vaccines and medicine several times since 2020, and the North has refused it, with them even mocking them for offering. And while the North acts like it's a trick, a lot of countries who don't get along with the U.S. still get humanitarian aid from them, right? Like Syria and Yemen. So it's unclear what the end game is, because they don't want aid and they don't want to renegotiate. But hey, follow to stay in the loop.
And that was the military shorts. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, the motivational shorts.
there is this cultural push away from marriage and raising children. It's because a man and a woman in a healthy, God-fearing marriage with children that they are responsible for don't wonder what they're fighting for. It can't so easily be taken away. They know what they're fighting for because they tuck it in at night. That is the people that are very, very difficult to defeat or control. And so when you know those things, and then you find somebody else who knows those things, and you start to build a life together, I can tell you this, I've been married for almost 25 years now. We've been poor, we've been doing pretty well. We've had ups, we've had lows. I've never questioned my identity, I've never questioned my purpose. And as you have kids, it becomes more certain. If you are building your life first and foremost off of your faith, and then off of your family, and then you're developing this sort of spiritual, intellectual, emotional, and physical competency to be able to protect and provide for that family, to protect and provide for each other, and then to extend that out to your community, your church family. If you live your life in a way where you are more concerned about what God says when you arrive than what man says when you are gone, you will never regret that.
What if all of us took that attitude after we face a rejection and a no, or we have a meeting and no one shows up, or somebody say, you can count on me, and they don't come through? What if we have that kind of attitude? The car's repossessed. Nobody believes in you. You've lost again and again and again. The lights are cut off, but you're still looking at your dream, reviewing it every day, and say to yourself, it's not over until I win.
You're crazy until you're successful. Then you're a genius. And I think for a lot of people, when you're grinding as a small channel, people think you're too obsessed. You're a weirdo. Stop only making videos. Like, get a life. Be realistic. People will convince you you're out of your mind for wanting to do this. But then once you're successful, they're like, yo, your drive, your tenacity was great. But it's like, yeah, well, where was that back then? You know what I mean? I didn't get that when I was a small channel. And so I think you're crazy until you're successful. Then you're a genius.
Why are you so antisocial? Because I'm trying to get it. Why are you staying on the basketball court so much? Because I'm trying to get it. Why are you out there practicing in the hot sun when ain't nobody else out there? Because I'm trying to get it. The more weird you are is a reflection of how committed you are to focusing on your shit, molding and shaping and developing your ideas and your craft so that when it's time for you to make your rounds, you gonna fly.
You wake up, right to work. Immediately your mind is in action. No one wants to do that. No one. And I don't blame them. But don't be mad. When you're laying there in your fucking bed and you're in the fucking hospital and you're 70, 80, 90 years old and you're thinking, man, I feel like I didn't fucking do something. Because you did. You didn't do it. You didn't do shit. You may have lived a great life, man, but you're always going to feel empty inside. I don't feel empty. So call me what you want. There's not one empty bone in my fucking body. Because I have figured out that really the magic potion, at least to my life, and it's very rewarding.
No more fucking around. You want your life to be better? I can't help you. Lee can't help you. Joe Rogan can't help you. Ari can't help you. God can't fucking help you. Only you can fucking help you. Grab your fucking balls, get a fucking notebook, and write down what the fuck you're gonna do this year. And this is it. You're not gonna have these problems. Fuck the drugs. Fuck the cigarettes. It all starts fucking today, all right? No more fucking excuses. That's the fucking... This is the year of the fucking soldier.
It's time to stay focused. It's time to decide, fuck clubs, fuck partying, fuck trying to fit in. It's time to stay focused, man.
The bottom line is, no one's coming. No one's coming to push you. No one's coming to tell you to turn the TV off. No one's coming to tell you to get out the door and exercise. Nobody's coming to tell you to apply for that job that you've always dreamt about. Nobody's coming to write the business plan for you. It's up to you.
Understand that when you're trying to avoid the pain, when you're trying to avoid the struggle, when you're trying to avoid the hard things in life, you are actively choosing to be average. You are actively choosing to be mediocre. And you are actively choosing to move further away from what you want in life. Because that hardship and that pain and that struggle and that frustration, they give you the skills that will forge you into a motherfucking champion. All right, so remember that shit when you try to take the easy route. The easy route never pays well. The only route in life that pays well is the hard route. the struggle, the pain, the frustration, and the overcoming of those things. And not only do they pay, they fulfill you as well.
You know, these moments of depression when things go wrong, once you overcome them, you become stronger from them. And it's that moment in life later that is built upon failure. Same with success. Success is never gotten on the first time usually. It's failure to failure to failure, learning from your failures from one to another to another. You know, trying, even if you get knocked down, you continue to try and continue to try. Ensuring you never fail to try. It's that mentality. It's the mentality, bring it on, motherfucker, I can take it. You can't break this shit. I'm stronger than you think I am. And everything you throw at me and all the hardships you throw at me, you might knock me down, but I get back up and I'll be stronger for it. It's that mentality that builds an iconic status that centuries from now people still talk about.
Every single person who wants to do something with their life and has done something with their life has gone through the exact chapter that you're going through. And it's the lonely chapter. It's the chapter where you don't fit in with your own friends, but you don't have the outcomes yet to fit into a new group of friends. And you're going through this and you're like, is this even worth it? Because you have no signs of success, right? But if there's anything that you can take away from what we're saying right now is that the sign of success is the hate that you get along the way.
It's time to stay focused. It's time to decide clubs, partying, trying to fit in and socialize. Why are you so antisocial? Because I'm trying to get it. Why are you staying on the basketball court so much? Because I'm trying to get it. The more weird you are is a reflection of how committed you are to focusing on your molding and shaping and developing your ideas and your craft so that when it's time for you to make your rounds, you're going to fly.
Success. What does it mean? Loneliness. Culpability. Failure. Reflection. Regret. Sadness. Emptiness. But it's not only that. It is also hope. Determination. Improvement. Progress. Learning. Resilience. Discipline. Remember that failures are only part of the story, but they are necessary to achieve success.
I think people gain a tremendous amount of wisdom when they travel, when they wander, when they allow themselves, as I did, to get lost. And maybe you'll find yourself somewhere. I think we look down now to 16-year-olds and say, where are you going to go to college? What are you going to do for the rest of your life? And it's like, they're not fully baked yet. How do they know? Give them a break. Take a year off. Take 2 years off. Join the Peace Corps. Travel. Go figure things out. Or just enjoy yourself. For the first time in their lives, they're adults, and they don't have to be somewhere. They're not told to be somewhere. Get used to that freedom. Get used to having the need to self-govern yourself. You know, to be able to employ self-discipline.
And that was the Motivational Shorts. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the daily laws for January the 25th.
January 25th. Change yourself from within, little by little. We humans tend to fixate on what we can see with our eyes. It is the most animal part of our nature. When we look at the changes in other people's lives, we see the good luck that someone had in meeting a person with all of the right connections and the funding. We see the project that brings the money and the attention. In other words, we see the visible signs of opportunity and success in our own lives, but we are grasping at an illusion. What really allows for such dramatic changes are the things that occur inside a person. The slow accumulation of knowledge and skills, the incremental improvements in work habits, and the ability to withstand criticism. Any change in people's fortunes is merely the visible manifestation of all of that deep preparation over time. By essentially ignoring this internal invisible aspect, we fail to change anything fundamental within ourselves. And so in a few years' time, we reach our limits. Yet again, we grow frustrated. We crave change. We grab at something quick and superficial, and we remain prisoners forever of these recurring patterns in our lives. The answer is to reverse this perspective. Stop fixating on what other people are saying and doing. Stop fixating on the money, the connections, the outward appearance of things. Instead, look inward. Focus on the smaller internal changes that lay the groundwork for a much larger change in fortune. It is the difference between grasping at an illusion and immersing yourself in reality. And reality is what will liberate and transform you. Daily law. What would you work on if no one was looking? If money were no object? TED Talk. The Key to Transforming Yourself. October 23rd, 2013.
And that was the Daily Law for January the 25th from the book The Daily Laws by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, picking up where we left off on the 33 strategies of war.
In 1314, the Scots finally engaged in direct combat with the English at the Battle of Bannockburn and defeated them. It was a most humiliating loss for Edward II, who swore to avenge it. In 1322, he decided to finish Bruce off once and for good with a vigorous campaign worthy of his father. Organizing and personally leading the largest army yet to fight the rebellious Scots, Edward got as far as Edinburgh Castle. At one point, he sent foragers out to look for food in the countryside. They returned with a single decrepit bull and an empty wagon. Dysentery swept the English troops. Edward was forced to retreat, and when he reached northern England, he saw that the Scots had once again razed the fields there, and more thoroughly than ever. Hunger and disease finished off the remnants of his army. The campaign was such a disaster that a rebellion broke out among Edward's lords. He fled, but in 1327 was captured and killed. The following year, Edward's son, Edward III, negotiated a peace with the Scots, granting Scotland its independence and recognizing Robert the Bruce as its rightful king. Interpretation. The English thought they could move on Scotland with impunity anytime they wanted. The Scots were poorly equipped, and their leadership was bitterly divided. Seeing such weakness, what could prevent English conquest? Trying to stop what seemed inevitable, Robert the Bruce evolved a novel strategy. When the English attacked, he did not take them on directly. He would have lost. Instead, he hit them indirectly, but where it hurt, doing exactly to the English what they were doing to him, ruining his country. He continued to play tit for tat until the English understood that every time they attacked Scotland, they would get a bloody nose in exchange. They would lose valuable farmland, be harassed, fight in abysmal conditions. They slowly lost their hunger for the fight, then finally gave up. The essence of this deterrent strategy is the following. When someone attacks you or threatens you, you make it clear that he will suffer in return. He or she may be stronger, he may be able to win battles, but you will make him pay for each victory. Instead of taking him on directly, you hurt something he values, something close to home. You make him understand that every time he bothers you, he can expect damage, even if on a smaller scale. The only way to make you stop attacking him in your irritating fashion is for him to stop attacking you. You are like a wasp on his skin. Most people leave wasps alone. 3. One morning in 1474, King Louis XI, 1423 to 83, France's infamous Spider King, so named because he always wove the most intricate and well-conceived plots against his enemies, went into a vehement rant against the Duke of Milan. The courtiers present that January day listened in amazement as the normally composed and careful king spun out his suspicions. Although the Duke's father had been a friend, the son could not be trusted. He was working against France, breaking the treaty between the two countries. On and on the king went. Perhaps he would have to take action against the Duke. Suddenly, to the courtiers' dismay, a man slipped quietly out of the room. It was Cristoforo da Bollate, the Milanese ambassador to France. Bollate had been received graciously by the king earlier that morning, but then had retreated into the background. Louis must have forgotten he was there. The king's diatribe could cause quite a diplomatic mess. Later that day, Louis invited Bollate to his private rooms, and lounging on his bed, began an apparently casual conversation. Drifting into politics, he described himself as a supporter of the Duke of Milan's. He would do anything, he said, to help the Duke expand his power. Then he asked, "Tell me, Cristoforo, has it been reported to you what I said this morning in council? Tell me the truth. Was it not some courtier who told you?" Bollate confessed that he had actually been in the room during the king's tirade and had heard the king's words himself. He also protested that the Duke of Milan was a loyal friend of France. Louis replied that he had his doubts about the Duke and had cause to be angry. But then he immediately changed the subject to something pleasant, and Bollate eventually left. The next day, the king sent 3 counselors to visit Bollate. Was he comfortable in his lodgings? Was he happy with his treatment from the king? Was there anything they could do to improve his stay at the French court? They also wanted to know if he was going to pass on the king's words to the Duke. The king, they said, considered Bollate a friend, a confidant. He had merely been venting his emotions. It meant nothing. Bollate should forget the whole thing. Of course, none of these men, the counselors, the courtiers, Bollate, knew that the king had done all this deliberately. Louis was certain that the perfidious ambassador, whom he hardly considered a friend, let alone a confidant, would report what he had said in detail to the Duke. He knew that the Duke was treacherous, and this was precisely how Louis wanted to send him a warning. And it seemed the message got through. For the next several years, the Duke was an obedient ally. Interpretation. The Spider King was a man who always plotted several moves in advance. In this case, he knew that if he spoke politely and diplomatically to the ambassador of his worries about the Duke, his words would carry no weight. They would seem like whining. If he vented his anger directly to the ambassador, on the other hand, he would look out of control. A direct thrust is also easily parried. The Duke would just mouth reassurances, and the treachery would go on. By transmitting his threat indirectly, however, Louis made it stick. That the Duke was not meant to know he was angry made his anger truly ominous. It meant he was planning something and wanted to keep the Duke from suspecting it and knowing his true feelings. He delivered his threat insidiously to make the Duke ponder his intentions and to instill an uneasy fear. When we are under attack, the temptation is to get emotional, to tell the aggressors to stop, to make threats as to what we'll do if they keep going. That puts us in a weak position. We've revealed both our fears and our plans, and words rarely deter aggressors. Sending them a message through a third party, or revealing it indirectly through action, is much more effective. That way, you signal that you are already maneuvering against them. Keep the threat veiled. If they can only glimpse what you're up to, they will have to imagine the rest. Making them see you as calculating and strategic will have a chilling effect on their desires to harm or attack you. It is not worth the risk to find out what you may be up to. 4. In the early 1950s, John Boyd, 1927 to 97, served with distinction as a fighter pilot in the Korean War. By the middle of that decade, he was the most respected flight instructor at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. He was virtually unbeatable in practice dogfights, so good that he was asked to rewrite the manual on fighter pilot tactics. He had developed a style that would demoralize and terrorize, get inside the opponent's head, disrupt his ability to react. Boyd was clever and fearless. But none of his training and skill, none of his brushes with death as a pilot, prepared him for the bloodless backstabbing, political maneuvering, and indirect warfare of the Pentagon, where he was assigned in 1966 to help design lightweight jet fighters. As Major Boyd quickly discovered, Pentagon bureaucrats were more concerned with their careers than with national defense. They were less interested in developing the best new fighter than in satisfying contractors, often buying their new technological gear regardless of its suitability. Boyd, as a pilot, had trained himself to see every situation as a kind of strategic combat, and in this instance, he decided to transfer his skills and style of warfare to the jungles of the Pentagon. He would intimidate, discourage, and outsmart his opponents. Boyd believed that a streamlined jet fighter of the kind he was designing could outperform any plane in the world. The contractors hated his design because it was inexpensive. It did not highlight the technology they were trying to peddle. Meanwhile, Boyd's colleagues in the Pentagon had their own pet projects. Competing for the same pot of money, they did everything they could to sabotage or transform his design. Boyd developed a defense. Outwardly, he looked a little dumb. He wore shabby suits, smoked a nasty cigar, kept a wild look in his eye. He seemed to be just another emotional fighter pilot, promoted too fast and too soon. But behind the scenes, he mastered every detail. He made sure he knew more than his opponents. He could quote statistics, studies, and engineering theories to support his own project and poke holes through theirs. Contractors would show up in meetings with glossy presentations delivered by their top engineers. They would make fantastic claims to dazzle the generals. Boyd would listen politely, seem impressed, and then suddenly, without warning, he would go on the offensive, deflating their optimistic claims, showing in detail that the numbers did not add up, revealing the hype and the fakery. The more they protested, the more vicious Boyd got, bit by bit, tearing their project to shreds. Blindsided by a man they had grossly underestimated, time and again the contractors would leave these meetings vowing revenge.
And that was the next part of Chapter 10, Create a Threatening Presence, from the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now it's going to be Chapter 3 of the book None Braver. And this was the book that I was planning on having playing yesterday. But again, because of technical difficulties, it didn't happen. So here, Chapter 3, Michael Hirsch's None Braver.
Chapter 1. Hey, we got company. November 2nd to 3rd, 2001. If you could ask Genghis Khan, Queen Victoria, or Leonid Brezhnev, they'd all tell you the same thing. Afghanistan is an especially rotten place to fight a war. The climate is inhospitable, the topography brutal, and the indigenous tribes won't run from a good fight. Just consider the terrain. The southern third of the country is an unforgiving desert-like plateau. Nomads and the occasional gaggle of Taliban flowing unhampered across the Pakistani border in both directions populate it. In the central two-thirds of the country are the Hindu Kush Mountains, a chain nearly 1,000 miles long and 200 miles wide, running from the northeast out of northern Pakistan to the southwest into Iran. The range has more than 24 peaks above 23,000 feet and alternates between high ridges and deep valleys. This pretty much explains why the entire country, which is about the size of Texas, has only 16 miles of railroad track, and the roads aren't good enough to be considered deplorable. And then there are the millions of landmines strewn across the countryside to think about, a capricious reminder of what's been going on since the late 70s. Flying over the Hindu Kush in daylight, the mountains appear bare, rocky, and devoid of life, either plant or human, which is why it's a shock to air crews crossing the Kush at night when they see campfires burning above the 10,000-foot level. Living at that altitude is difficult to contemplate. Fighting at that altitude is beyond difficult, but routinely contemplated. Altitude sickness can strike even the fittest warrior who is unaccustomed to the elevation, and the only cure is to descend to lower levels. In the opening of the war, American air support for special operations, both rotary and fixed-wing, flew primarily from Karshi-Khanabad, Uzbekistan in the north, and from Jacobabad, Pakistan in the south. It was one of the northern-based helicopter units flying MH-47 Chinooks that got the call to evacuate an American Special Operation Forces, SOF, soldier whose high-altitude sickness had apparently advanced to the potentially fatal condition known as high-altitude cerebral edema, HACE. The onset of HACE usually doesn't occur until the individual has been at high altitude for more than half a day, which is why it wouldn't be expected to affect helicopter crews on relatively short missions. And HACE doesn't strike everyone. Some people get it, others don't, irrespective of their physical conditioning. The symptoms of HACE include loss of coordination, weakness, decreasing levels of consciousness, including disorientation, loss of memory, hallucinations, psychotic behavior, and ultimately coma. What happens in HACE is that fluid leaks out of capillaries, resulting in swelling of brain tissue. According to Princeton University's Outdoor Action Center, immediate descent of 2,000 to 4,000 feet is a necessary life-saving measure, followed by evacuation to a medical facility for proper follow-up treatment. Very little in Operation Enduring Freedom happens in a communications vacuum. Between SATCOM, satellite communications, assorted radio channels, the classified version of MIRC, Military Internet Relay Chat, SIPRNet, classified IP router network, which is the command and control version of the Internet, and NIPRNet, non-classified IP router network, the unclassified email system that gives deployed military forces Internet access. It's difficult for the duty officer in any operations center in the theater of operations not to know what's going on. This is why folks at the Air Force's 20th Special Operations Squadron, based at Jacobabad, were aware of the drama some 350 to 400 miles to the north. They were ready to help when the Army rescue helicopters from the north had to turn back after devoting a couple of hours trying to pierce impenetrable weather in order to reach the soldier. The word was that it was a life-or-death situation. A special operator with Northern Alliance forces, who are in the middle of the heaviest fighting in Afghanistan, had developed what was thought to be acute mountain sickness, which over the course of a few days had led to his being diagnosed with HACE. He had now become a burden to his small unit, which was actively involved in combat operations. There was also fear that if he wasn't evacuated soon, should he manage to survive the ordeal, he'd suffer permanent brain damage. This was before the fall of Kandahar, before the fall of Kabul, even before the Mazar-e-Sharif bombing incident. There were fewer than 100 American soldiers in Afghanistan at the time, all of them special operations types whose principal task was spotting targets for coalition bombers. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda still owned the country, except where the Northern Alliance had pockets of control high up in the mountains. Captain Frank, a 34-year-old Pavlo pilot with 7 years of helicopter flying in the Army before coming to the Air Force, had done the planning for missions into this part of Afghanistan and knew they were high risk. "I'm not worrying about who's going to shoot at me. I'm worrying about power and weather," he told his commander at the pre-mission briefback. Frank was unhappy at being compelled to fly a high-altitude approach that nobody really wanted. His preference would have been to follow a route near Kabul, but the refueling tankers couldn't support them there. Aircraft Commander Captain Frank, his co-pilot Captain Keith Nicholas, and Major Peter Forrest, a mission commander who would be flying with them, say that their analysis indicated that if everything went perfectly, they could make it in from the south. The reason the Army helicopter couldn't get through was that the entire northern half of Afghanistan was socked in with fog, rain, or snow, but the victim was actually south of the bad weather. They believed that weather wouldn't be a factor for them, and if it became a factor, they could maneuver around it. About 15 minutes after sunset on what would become a bright moonlit night, they took off as chalk lead on a 2-ship mission, call signs Knife 03 and Knife 04 in MH-53 Pavlos, the largest helicopter in the Air Force inventory and the only model that's outfitted with the most advanced terrain-following, terrain avoidance radar. Chalk is an identifying term for a load of troops and their transport. Chalk lead would be the helicopter carrying the mission commander and a number of troops. For flying into the twisting valleys and rising terrain they were going to encounter, it was the perfect aircraft. Just over an hour later, they crossed the border into Afghanistan and were setting up to do the first of several aerial refuelings, AR, when their high-tech radar failed. Since the moon was bright and visibility, viz, was forever, they elected to press on. Forrest explains that the radar is designed to help them in bad weather and low visibility situations. If the weather and viz weren't going to be a problem, then proceeding without it would be safe. They'd also prepared a backup plan. We knew Chalk 2 had good radar, so if we had any problem along our route, we'd let 2 go ahead and take a look into the weather, see how it was. Clearly, weather problems were not foremost in their minds at this point. They'd spent time on the ground getting intel on where the soldier had to be picked up. What was preeminent at this point was coordination for getting the refuelers in place, getting fast movers in place should they need fire support, and making sure that when they finally did pick him up that they could take care of him medically. When they were launched, higher headquarters basically told them, "We don't think this guy's going to make it." They were also worried about the altitude at which they'd be operating. The Pavlos manufacturer, Sikorsky Aircraft, says the operating ceiling of the $40 million helicopter is 16,000 feet. Listening to the men who fly it talk, one has to presume that the Sikorsky specification writer is the ultimate optimist. With 11 people on board, including a special tactics squadron, STS team consisting of PJs Jamie Clark and Kenny Curtis, and combat controller Jason Brooks, plus all their gear, a pair of miniguns poking out the side windows, plus a 50 caliber machine gun on the ramp, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and enough fuel in the tanks to get to its next AR, the only way the 53 could get up to 16,000 feet would be in the belly of the transport plane that brought it to the war zone. Major Forrest is clear that once they reached the mountains, this mission was flown with no power to spare. Throughout this whole sortie, we were operating at the helo's max capabilities. If you want to say the edge of the flight envelope, we were on it and beyond it. The second AR took place just prior to the helicopters beginning their climb into the mountains, and it went perfectly. The artistry here was not so much making the AR work, but deciding how much gas they should be carrying. Forrest says, you kind of have to do a trade-off. The more gas you put on, the more you weigh. The heavier you are, the less altitude you can get. So you kind of balance it. Before we took off, we worked out what's our minimum fuel, what's our maximum fuel. And by the way, let's take on a few pounds for Mom and the kids. That's the fuel you dump later on when you say, oh, hell, I need to get out of here. As soon as they finished the AR, they started penetrating the mountains, alone and stupid, as the mission commander puts it, without a Herc tanker playing the role of mother hen. The helicopters can fly low to the ground, hugging the terrain and staying invisible. While a Herc can fly blacked out, it's not as nimble and, as will be demonstrated later in the war, it's less capable of staying out of trouble down in the valleys. When they need gas, they'll pick a meeting point and the 130 will do a tail chase, catch up, and then move ahead of them, top off the helos, and then head back to base to refuel. By now, it's around 10 p.m., and the 2 helicopters are flying at well in excess of 10,000 feet, as close to terrain as practical. They're over a big plateau, a dry lake bed, when they get the first indication that this mission might be more of an adventure than they bargained for. Knife 03's co-pilot, Captain Keith Nicholas, says, "This is when we start seeing the first onset of clouds, a scattered deck, and then it becomes pretty much socked in. But we've got about 1,000 feet or so between the terrain and the top of the clouds, and it's clear underneath." The clouds above them blocked the moonlight, making it a bit more of a strain to see with their night vision goggles, but as long as the 2 helicopters can keep each other in sight, they decided to continue. We're continuing for a good hour or so, and the cloud deck is creeping down, getting lower, and we're looking at a point where we need to make a turn to get toward the Survivor. But the valley where we've done our route study and are intending to fly through is socked in. Nicholas was flying the helicopter, and Forrest was sitting on the floor behind the pilots, watching a console with a moving map display and handling radio communications with fire support, tankers, and command and control. On the 53s, the mission commander does all the coordinating, the pilots do the flying. And at this point, they were all worrying. I'm flying the helicopter, leading the 2-ship in, and I stick my nose into weather just to see how bad the viz is going to get. Hopefully we'll break out and it shouldn't be too bad. But we weren't lucky enough. Viz really was poor at that point, so we turned around back to where we started in that flat lake bed area. Fortunately, when they got back to the lake bed, the visibility there was still acceptable, although the cloud deck had dropped down to between 300 and 400 feet above terrain. That limited the flying space for the helicopters. With the pair of helicopters flying no more than 1 to 2 rotor diameters apart, they circled around the lake bed area while discussing their options. At that point, the decision was made to give Knife 04 the lead, letting him take the role of Pathfinder. Nicholas says, "We'd tuck in close to him if the weather got too bad. Hopefully we'd have viz on him and he'd use the systems to get us through this valley and on to the next one where the survivor was." Before they tried it, however, they sent two into the valley to actually fly the route to see how it was. When he came back, the report was good. "The clouds are actually pretty thin. We can proceed on." Pathfinder missions are basic technique for the MH-53. Part of what the helicopter was designed to do is lead other aircraft into areas where their own navigation aids can't take them. They did it in Desert Storm, although leading another 53 into the weather was a unique event. With Lieutenant Mike flying Knife 04 in the lead, Captain Frank on the controls of 03, and only about 30 more minutes of flying time to the survivor, the crews are feeling optimistic. All they have to do is go through a few more miles of bad weather, and then if it breaks clear, they get the guy, get out of bad guy land, and head home. While they don't have direct communication with his Special Ops unit, they're getting messages via SATCOM from the Joint Special Operations Air Center, JSOAC, which is in contact with the SOF team, that he's still alive, he's stable, and they're at the LZ waiting for the rescue choppers to come in. About a mile into the weather, they're 2 rotor diameters behind Knife 04 when the leading helicopter completely disappeared from sight. At that point, Frank makes an immediate decision to abort the entire mission. It's one thing to put 22 lives at risk to save one. That's what they do in the Pave-Low community. But the guys who fly those helicopters are neither foolhardy nor stupid. They understand there's no point in tempting fate when the deck is so clearly stacked against you. The pilot asks Pete to make the call on the satellite radio, and the airborne mission commander comes back with what Frank says is the right question. "Let's think about this. There's a guy's life on the line." The two discuss it at length and ultimately agree that the rescue mission has to be aborted. The AMC got a mental image of 2 pieces of machinery trying to occupy the same space at the same time. "Hey guys," Frank says on comm, "I'm breaking off, left turn." His expectation is that the crew members scanning out the side windows will watch for terrain and clear him around. Since they'd been on the left side of the lead helo, he put his ship into a left 180-degree turn and went back to where the weather was clear, while Forrest called the other helicopter to say they've lost sight of him and are going back to their hold point. Hearing that Knife 03 has elected to bail out, Knife 04 now moves to join them in clear airspace and comes close to crashing. Nicholas recalls that 04 almost crashed during that turn because he went completely blind as well. Couldn't see anything. "I know 04's VVI, his vertical velocity indicator, had a pretty good sync rate, but he was able to salvage the aircraft and turn it around and recover." Forrest elaborated on what happened up there in the dark in the clouds. "You got a tight valley, so when we called and said, 'Hey, we've got to do a 180, he has to give us a few seconds to get separation from him so that he can make his turn and not worry about turning into us. Now, the valley's a little bit narrower there, so he had to make a real tight turn at a real high altitude, and when you do that, the helicopter's only got a certain speed, a window we can operate in, and he almost got bit by what will bite us about 20 minutes from this point." Once both helicopters were back over the plateau, they began flying a wagon wheel, a large circle with the birds on opposite sides of the wheel. Even there, however, the weather was rapidly deteriorating. The cloud deck was down to 200 feet, and what had been clear air was getting foggy. While flying the wheel, the pilots talk with each other. "Are we going to stay here in orbit and wait the weather out? Are we going to land, or are we going to get out of these mountains and go to where the weather is better?" Captain Frank concludes that the best thing they can do is dump gas and land. Flying helicopters at high altitude is a juggling act. You can be too heavy to land as well as too heavy to take off. The solution is to dump gas, land, take off, and immediately find a tanker to refuel. To the AMC, that didn't make sense because that meant they wouldn't be able to take off and go anywhere once the weather cleared. Forrest says, "In all honesty, the hardest decision in my life was made at that point, which was, I know this guy is life or death, but I've got to leave him in the field. So at that point, I made the hardest call I've ever made in my life. Abort. We're abort, guys. In my mind, I'm thinking that I've just, in essence, killed this guy because I can't rescue him." The issue is not one of personal bravery, nor a matter of willingness to fight the elements. It's a sensible conclusion based on the capabilities of the equipment they've been given to prosecute the mission. Co-pilot Nicholas says, "The problem with the weather is that we won't be able to see any of the terrain around us, and being power limited at those extreme altitudes, even with all the training and everything that we have, that helicopter just didn't have enough power to make it over. So if we lost viz on the mountains, it increased our potential for running into terrain, and that's what we did not want to happen." By this time, in the face of diminishing visibility, 03 and 04 had waited a bit too long to join up and head for safer territory. The problem with orbiting in a wagon wheel is that when you're on opposite sides of the wheel, one ship is flying in one direction and the other is heading the other way. Now, 03 asks the pilot of 04 to take the lead and guide them south, out of the mountains. So 03 breaks out of the circle and attempts to rejoin 04, but they're tail chasing him from about a mile behind, trying to catch up. Pilot Frank sees his wingman's anti-collision light flash twice, then watches as Knife 04 goes into the weather to the south and disappears. I fly right up against it, the weather, as close as I can go. I know there's terrain on both sides. What's in my mind is there's no way I'm going in the weather. It's a death sentence. What they do is call the other ship. "Hey, we need you to come back. We need to rejoin up, get tighter with you, and then you lead us out of here." Unfortunately, while they were heading north into the valley that would take them to the Survivor, the bad weather was creeping in behind them. Now, as they head south, they are trapped. Nicholas says, "We're in a little sucker hole, so to speak, a pocket, and all the valleys that lead that area are totally socked in with weather. And they can't climb, and they can't land." The decision they make is just to stay airborne and let Knife 04 rejoin them, then use that ship as a pathfinder to lead them out, with the hope that the weather to the south was not as impenetrable as it was to the north. The problem is that Knife 04 now can't find them in the clouds. Nicholas attempted to provide 04 with GPS coordinates, but as he was transmitting, someone in another aircraft keyed in on the same frequency. The radio call got stepped on, so he didn't get to hear the coordinates. The last words Lieutenant Mike heard from us is, "Stand by." Not knowing that 04 didn't get the coordinates, the cockpit crew of Knife 03 has moved into survival mode. They're taught to prioritize their tasks when stressed. Aviate, navigate, communicate. Forrest explains, the first thing to do is fly the helicopter. Second thing is to make sure you're flying in the right place you want to go, and the third thing is to talk to somebody. The pilot, Captain Frank, is flying the aircraft. Abe, the center engineer, and the co-pilot are navigating. Clint, the left gunner, Brian Daisy, the tail gunner, and Jeff, the right engineer gunner, are scanning. And both the co-pilot and MC are on the radios. Forrest remembers that they're literally flying from valley to valley, ridge to ridge, just trying to keep flying. On the moving map display, they spot a valley that looks like it may take them out of trouble, but in order to get to it, they have to go over a small village and 2 ridgelines.
And that was the first part of Chapter 3, and next week we will get more on whether or not they're able to pick up this person that has high-altitude sickness. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now we're going to pick up where we left off with Inside Delta Force, where the author and his teammates have just arrived in Beirut, Lebanon, and they're about to start their new assignment protecting the embassy, the U.S. embassy in Lebanon.
He dropped the phony accent and snorted in disgust. But I don't shut up about it. I put in a report to the RSO, Regional Security Officer, and the Ambassador every week, and I'm going to put it in my report when I get back to the States, and I expect you'll do the same thing. This ain't Paris or London, and not putting proper security in a place with the threat we got here is downright criminal. Sooner or later, somebody's going to get killed. That, unfortunately, turned out to be not just an accurate assessment of the situation, but a terribly prophetic pronouncement. After we plucked my tools out of the pouch, Donnie gave me a tour of the building and showed me the security offices and the 3 routes to the ambassador's suite of offices. Then we went to the basement to meet the ambassador's staff of local bodyguards, or at least the Muslim staff, Because it was hard for Muslims to cross to the east side and for Christians to cross to the west, and also because of some animosity on the staff, the local bodyguards were mostly segregated by religion. The Christian members of the force guarded the residents at Yarza, and the Muslim members made up the bodyguard detail and embassy guards. There was one notable exception to this division of labor, and he was a most notable man, an Armenian Christian named Cesar, who was both a bodyguard and motorcade driver. Armenians are ubiquitous throughout the Middle East, and Cesar, like so many of his countrymen, was not only a courageous man, but one who didn't give a whit of thought to Christian-Muslim friction. Also, like so many of his countrymen, he had flaming red hair and blue eyes. I've protected ambassadors, presidents, princes, princesses, CEOs, celebrity prisoners, and the offspring of all of the above. And the one constant in this line of work is that you must keep the relationship completely businesslike and at arm's length. If you become emotionally engaged with the principal, you start making compromises that will eventually cause harm to the very person you are supposed to be protecting. I've never wanted to be buddies with the person I'm protecting. I don't require their friendship. The only thing I need or want is a civil and professional relationship. But it's a different story with the local national bodyguards on a protective detail. The relationship you have with these men is the same kind of relationship you'll find in a combat squad or team. Not only do you depend on these guys to get the job done, but more often than not, you depend on them for your very life. I probably would not have lived through that tour in Beirut if it had not been for those local bodyguards, and I came to love them. When I first met my local comrades, they were lounging in the basement ready room. I have to say, they were the most intimidating group of characters any potential foe could hope or fear to meet. I'm not saying they were piratical looking or disfigured or even ugly. Far from it. In fact, the Lebanese, both men and women, are one of the most handsome nationalities on earth, and these men were no exception. They had such an air of competence, determination, and self-confidence that they projected an almost visible aura of controlled, intelligent, and disciplined power. These were 16 tough, capable men who, day in and day out, had been handling an extremely hazardous undertaking in the most dangerous spot on the planet. You just didn't survive in that job unless you were very, very good. And as I was to find out, these men were very, very good. I introduced myself around the room. I had already met Abdo and the Muqdad cousins, and as I circled the room and greeted each man, I knew I had fallen in with good company. The two shift leaders were Mahmoud Butari and Mustafa Kridea, and they were about as different as any two Levantines can possibly be. Butari was of medium height and built like an all-conference tackle. He had a bull-like voice and could wield it like a weapon when he needed to, but otherwise he was a rather professorial type of man. His appearance was European, his French was immaculate, and his English was very good. He took care of all the administrative needs for the detail and was the man who knew everybody who was anybody in the city. He also took his place in the protective detail every day. Mustafa looked like a Bedouin and had a slender build and a sly, well-oiled sense of humor. But there was also an undeniable sense of authority about him, and his word was always the final one, no matter what the circumstance or the situation. His English was okay, and he made it a point to work with me every day on my Arabic. As he explained, one day I might find myself alone and have to depend on words to get out of a bad situation. And since half of the detail understood very little English, I needed to know how to give commands in Arabic during an emergency. Mustafa also had an infallible sixth sense, and when he smelled trouble, it was always just over the horizon. Muhammad al-Kurdi drove the advance vehicle, and by any standard, he was a bona fide character. It was his job to find us the safest and best routes through the city, and he was a master at it. Had Muhammad been in Hollywood during the 1930s, he would have been a natural as a swashbuckling matinee idol. He looked like a darker, more muscular, and slightly sinister version of Errol Flynn. He lived in a room in the basement of the embassy, where he composed poetry late into the night for the women he met during the day. He was as persistent as he was prolific. But in his basement sanctuary, he was fairly safe from irate husbands, fathers, and fiancés who didn't appreciate his style of verse. His radio call sign was Eisenhower, and he thought of himself as the commander-in-chief. Maher Mokdad became my right-hand man and was someone I depended on greatly. At 22, he was the youngest man on the detail, but he demonstrated an uncanny maturity. He was very intelligent. He had taught himself English, well-built, and had the startling amber eyes of a lion. He was from Baalbek in the Bekaa Valley, a place well known throughout the Middle East for courageous men, and Maher was a champion of his race. He taught me the small personal wisdom of picking a lime at the residence every morning and keeping it in my shirt pocket. Whenever the foul smell of the city became too much, I could squeeze the small green fruit and rub its oil on my nose and lips, where the sweet, clean scent would banish the stench of death for a while. To this day, my favorite scent is that of a small, freshly picked lime. I became very close to Salim Tamim. To use another Hollywood metaphor, if you were casting the handsome and dashing warrior sheik, Salim would be your first pick. I could always count on him for wise counsel and pertinent guidance, often delivered via a talent he uniquely possessed. Salim was perfectly able to communicate complex thought, give commands, and ask questions using only the movement of his eyebrows and facial expressions, and it worked across any language barrier. It was unreal, but seemed so natural that I only realized he was doing it after I had worked with him for several weeks. A few of the guys stretched my leadership skills on occasion, and now and again we would all fall into some rip-roaring arguments. But that was only natural, and even when we disagreed among ourselves, or when someone questioned my methods in a particular situation, it was always about technique and not the principle of the matter. We all wanted the same thing, to do the best job we could to protect our ambassador and stay alive while we did it. And if a man's not passionate about his work in that kind of job, then he has neither his heart nor his mind in the right place. After introducing me to the bodyguards, Donnie took me to our home in the Hotel Charles, which was located about 6 blocks from the embassy and less than half a block from the Green Line. The owner, a man named Charlie, wasn't in, so we went directly to our suite on the floor just below the penthouse. We could see a good portion of the northern part of the city from the apartment balcony, so Donnie pointed out the sights. A couple of 100 meters to the east, right smack in the middle of the Green Line, was the old Holiday Inn. If you remember any of the news footage of the Civil War in Lebanon, you might recall scenes of the constant fighting for control of the Holiday Inn. It was the tallest structure in the area and sat on a strategically commanding spot, which made it a focal point of fighting, much like the tractor factory was in Stalingrad during the Second World War. The building was shattered and riddled with holes caused by everything from rifles and machine guns to mortar and artillery fire. But it was still standing, and it was still a hot spot. Donnie warned me never to stand in front of the little window over our kitchen sink, because machine gun fire from the Holiday Inn would occasionally hit the wall on our side of the building, and a seeing eye round would come uninvited through the window and into the kitchen. They had actually lost 2 refrigerators to gunfire in the last month. He also told me with some relish that it would be a good idea to wash dishes crouched on the floor, especially for someone as tall as I am. He seemed to think the vision of that was hilarious. From the apartment, we could see downhill and along the shoreline to the port, the nearby Hotel George, and the Syrian army positions along the northern part of the Green Line. I was warned to watch out for the Syrians. They tended to shoot first and not bother to ask questions. They weren't particularly vicious, but they were in the unenviable position of attempting to keep peace in the city, and peace had fled this place years ago. By all accounts, the nearest place peace could be found was on the island of Cyprus, and even there it kept a low profile. Then he pointed out the locations in the surrounding neighborhoods occupied by the different military and militia groups, and the corners where they usually set up their checkpoints. Just below us, between the hotel and the waterfront, was a small group known as the Nasserites, who revered the late Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser. They even had a statue of him on a street corner. Right next to the Hotel George was the Garbage Dump Gang, which controlled the approaches to the port and the garbage dump that had formed on a spit of land next to the hotel. Donnie said they sort of reminded him of the sanitation workers union back home in New York. Back to the west and just up from the waterfront was a group called the Morabi Tun, a small group that made up for their lack of size by sheer viciousness. At the approaches to the Green Line were first the Syrians and then the Lebanese army checkpoints. In the Green Line itself were refugees who had fled the fighting in other parts of the country and had homesteaded the rubble of no man's land. If you elected to live in the Green Line, the ground zero of fighting in Beirut, it had to be really bad where you came from. The Green Line militia didn't bother anyone. They just tried to keep out other squatters and claim jumpers. On the other side of the line was the monolithic Christian militia, the Phalange, the strongest of all the different groups. The Phalange were supplied, equipped, and funded by the Israelis. For some unknown reason, perhaps just the arrogance of power, they were the only ones who liked to screw with our freedom of movement. They could be downright hostile and often tried to cause trouble with the ambassador's motorcade. Closer to home was the local militia, which controlled the neighborhood surrounding the Hotel Charles and the area extending to the United States Embassy. In English, they were known as the PSP, which stood for People's Socialist Party. Even though they were generally a pretty quiet bunch, they went unmolested by the adjacent militias and didn't allow the Syrians to operate in the neighborhood, which was quite a feat in itself. The headquarters for the group was at a coffee house on the Corniche, Waterfront Boulevard. Donnie told me that Abdo lived in the neighborhood and that I should get him to introduce me to the leaders of the PSP group. From the way he talked, as well as the things he didn't say, I got the impression Donnie may have had some type of run-in with the PSP. Not unusual. Donnie usually inspired strong feelings in the people he met, and those feelings weren't always affectionate. But it wasn't anything he worried about, and whenever he had a negative reaction from someone, he brushed it off with an appropriate Brooklyn street saying, something along the lines of, "Fuck 'em if they can't take a joke." We called the embassy, and Abdo and the Muqdads came to pick us up for the trip to the ambassador's residence. From our hotel, we swung downhill to the waterfront, and in just a few minutes, we were negotiating the passage of the Green Line. First, we went through a Syrian army checkpoint, where they recognized the car and waved us through. Next was the Lebanese army position. The soldiers there stayed within their sandbagged position as one guy stuck an arm out of the bunker's aperture and motioned us to continue on. Then we were into the port itself. On the left was the harbor and its wharves with sunken cargo ships that had been caught in the fighting, rendering the facility unusable. To the right were huge stacks and jumbled heaps of old shipping containers, where Maher said the shooting generally came from. Abdo floored the old Chevy just as the road we were on headed through the middle of a large warehouse, and we punched in one side and straight out the other. As it penetrated the warehouse, the flanks of the roadway were hedged in by containers stacked from the floor to the ceiling, making passage through the building feel like hurtling down a narrow canyon. Emerging into the sunlight on the other side, we flew past another Lebanese army position, and then we were in Christian East Beirut. "Get ready," Donnie said. "If there's going to be any shit, it will be here." At this point, the road was hemmed in on each side by a triple row of oil barrels filled with sand. This barrel channel took us through a tight S-turn that brought us to the first barricade manned by the Falangistas. It was an impressive series of mutually supporting positions. There was the checkpoint itself, where vehicles were stopped and given a look-see, backed up by sandbagged positions on either side of the roadway that were just out of hand grenade range. 50 meters farther, there was a sandbagged 50-caliber machine gun position mounted on the roof of a 2-story building. Each spot was manned by 4 men armed with M16s. The men in the positions were fully uniformed and wore steel helmets with the chin straps in place. They were on full alert. The troops manning the checkpoint itself wore armored vests. We weren't stopped, but the men were deliberately slow about swinging the barrier and letting us through. I nodded to the man at the steel gate, and he returned my nod of acknowledgement with a curled lip sneer. In contrast to the militia checkpoints on the west side, with all their yelling and carrying on, it was quiet as we made our way through, but the cold eyes of the Falange soldiers never left us, nor did the muzzle of that 50 caliber machine gun. I didn't like the feeling of the place at all, but I could admire the discipline, structure, organization, and depth of force evident here. A firm, intelligent leadership was demonstrably in charge on this side of the city. We all relaxed after we made it through the Christian checkpoint, and the spirit in the car lightened noticeably. Abdo started singing as we rocketed down a wide, clean boulevard, and the Muqdads joined in with them. That's one of the things I enjoy whenever I work with Arabs. They love music and like to sing whenever the mood strikes. Within a month, I knew several of the songs and could join in even though I knew very little of the meaning of the words. But I did know the joy of life and living that was expressed in the songs, and that was the important thing. Soon we started to climb into the foothills of the Shuf Mountains. Donnie pointed out the kiss-your-ass curve where the motorcade had been ambushed. It was the perfect spot for an attack, one I would have selected myself. At an intersection, we turned uphill again and followed a sweeping curve around the crest of a hill that took us past the presidential palace. Abdo stopped the car, and we surveyed the scenery below and in front of us. Just down the hill were the grounds of the ambassador's residence. The surrounding area was rural and mostly open country, with scattered pockets of brush and the occasional small grove of olive trees. The terrain in front of us sloped down to the bottom of a wide valley 500 or 600 meters to the west. From there, the landscape became urban again and marched in a stair-step series of terraces up the next hill where the tortured scar of the Green Line could be seen, snaking its way north to south along the crest of the high ground about 2 miles in the distance. Behind us, the ground rose toward the east until it climbed into the mountain chain that separated the coastal region of Lebanon from the Bekaa Valley. After my general orientation, we got back into the car and 2 minutes later pulled into the gates of the residential compound. I caught up with Carl while Donnie and the guys went to the kitchen to find their friend Josephine, the cook, to see if they could sweet-talk her into cooking us something to eat. "It's good to see you, Carl," I said as we greeted one another. "But damn, brother, you've lost some weight since you've been here, haven't you?" "Man, tell me about it. I got a case of the Beirut belly last month and it damn near did me in. Lost over 20 pounds, all showered out my posterior aperture. And buddy, I can tell you it just ain't fun. I caught it from drinking a glass of tap water in our apartment," he said. "I usually know better, but I woke up one night with a terrible thirst, and before I thought about what I was doing, I went to the kitchen and downed a glassful from the sink." He shifted in his chair, as if the memory still hurt him. "The city has been pounded so hard that the sewer lines and the water lines are broken, and the stuff from one gets into the other. In essence, I drank a glass of shit that night, and by the next day it was ripping my guts apart. Horrible cramps, championship diarrhea, chills and spiking fevers, night sweats, fatigue that made me feel like a sack of Jell-O. I had days when I would have had to get better to feel good enough to die, and I had to work through it all."
And that was the next part of Aftermath. And next week will be the last part of this chapter of them in Beirut, last part of Aftermath, from the Inside Delta Force by Eric Haney, Command Sergeant Major, retired. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.